The sun hung low over the desert, a molten coin sinking into a sky streaked with orange and red. Heat shimmered above the cracked earth, distorting everything in a wavering haze. Dust rolled in slow, lazy waves across the plain, carrying the scent of sweat, horses, and sun-baked mesquite. It was the kind of evening when sound traveled far, when the smallest noise could echo like a gunshot, and that was exactly how the trouble had started. The girl in the blue dress, young, blonde, her braid dusty and frayed, had tried to run long before they caught her. She'd slipped through sagebrush and scrub, stumbled across thorny roots, and pressed herself low behind fallen logs. But the desert was open country, and the men hunting her were not amateurs. Their horses were stronger, their tempers hotter, and their patience razor-thin. By the time they dragged her back to town, the daylight had already begun to dim. The mob had grown fast, too fast. The sheriff, fueled by anger and the thrill of having a captive to blame for his town's misfortunes, had taken charge. He tied her to the dead tree that marked the old trial grounds, just outside the border of town. It was a gnarled, skeletal thing with no leaves, its branches twisting like fingers reaching toward the sky. Many a cowardly man had used that tree for justice. Many had used it for something far uglier. Tonight, it seemed, the sheriff wanted both. Her dress, once a clean, deep blue, was torn at the hem and stained from the chase. Dirt clung to the seat and sides where she'd fallen. Her knees were scraped, her palms raw from clawing at the ground to escape. She breathed hard, sharp breaths that made her shoulders rise and fall, but she refused to let her fear show on her face. She stood tall, spine straight, even as rough rope cut into her wrists. A crowd brewed around her, ranch hands, gamblers, farmers, and the kind of drifters drawn to trouble like flies to a carcass. Their muttering rose in uneven waves, carried by the desert wind. But none of that mattered compared to the sheriff's booming voice. "She's been caught aiding outlaws," he bellowed, pointing a thick, accusatory finger at her. "Hid them, fed them, helped them escape justice, and now she'll face her own." The crowd grumbled, kicked up dust, shifted restlessly. A few jeered, a few spat in the dirt. One man muttered that she didn't look dangerous. Another said looks didn't matter, not when justice needed doing. The girl held the sheriff's glare, her blue eyes sharp despite the exhaustion carved into her features. "I didn't help anyone," she said, voice steady. "I told you already." The sheriff's jaw clenched. Lying's a crime too. A few men in the crowd laughed. The sheriff swelled, enjoying the approval. He paced before her, long coat brushing the dirt, his badge catching the last flicker of sunlight. His boots thudded with each slow step, each one deliberate and heavy, like a judge deciding on a sentence before the verdict. Behind him, a deputy approached, the one who'd found her. He was younger, less steady, his eyes darting nervously between her and the men gathering behind them. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "maybe we should wait till morning. She's just a girl, and we don't have proof she—" The sheriff cut him off with a glare. "You questioning my judgment, Marshal?" The deputy swallowed. "No, sir." But his eyes lingered on the girl a moment longer, filled with something like sympathy, or maybe regret. The wind shifted suddenly, blowing harder, kicking a swirl of dust between the girl and the sheriff. She coughed and blinked grit from her eyes. Somewhere behind the crowd, a rider dismounted his horse, boots crunching dry earth. More men gathered. The sunset deepened to fire across the horizon, outlining every figure in stark gold. She felt the ropes bind tight against her wrists again as her fingers curled. She braced herself, not knowing what would come next, only knowing it wouldn't be good. The sheriff raised his hand high. The crowd fell silent, and for one breathless moment the desert held its stillness, waiting. The moment the sheriff's hand dropped, the town erupted, not in violence, not yet, but in argument. A dozen voices rose at once, each louder than the last, each echoing against the dusty wooden storefronts of the frontier settlement. Hang her, no trial, that ain't right, she's innocent, I'm tellin' you, she helped bandits, I saw tracks near her place, tracks don't prove a damn thing. The sheriff, enjoying every second of the turmoil he'd created, lifted both arms as if he were conducting an orchestra of fear. His voice boomed over the arguing townsfolk. Quiet, he roared, though he barely meant it. The chaos served him well. The angry knot of men and women didn't listen. They argued in clumps, on wooden porches in the street near the old water trough. Dust settled on their hats and coats as they shouted, pointing fingers, spit flying with their rage. Chickens clucked nervously near the saloon steps. Dogs barked at the rising tension. Even the horses shuffled and snorted uneasily, as if sensing the wrongness hanging over the air. The woman tied to the tree stayed silent. She watched it all unfold with wide, steady eyes, afraid, yes, but unbroken. The rope held her firmly against the rough bark, scraping her skin each time she shifted. The wind tugged at her torn dress, lifting its ragged edges like tattered flags, revealing bruises along her legs from the chase. Behind the sheriff, the deputy from before, young, troubled, and clearly conflicted, paced in short, stiff lines. His hand hovered near his belt, not his weapon, but the knife pouch he usually used to cut rope for horses. His eyes kept drifting toward her wrists. He wasn't the only one watching. Across the street, near the old feed store, a group of older townsmen huddled in a half circle, speaking in tense whispers. "Sheriff's goin' too far," muttered one, wiping sweat from his wrinkled brow. "Too far," another replied. "He passed too far 3 sheriffs ago. We need proof before we string someone up." "Well, you go tell him that." A hush fell over their small circle. No one volunteered. At the same time, on the saloon balcony above them, 2 card players leaned over the railing, drawn outside by the commotion. One squinted at the girl below, brow furrowed. "She doesn't look like someone who'd help outlaws," he murmured. The other snorted. "Since when do looks matter round here? Might be she's smarter than she looks. Might be the sheriff's using her to save face." The first replied, "Town's been on edge since the bank robbery. Folks want someone to blame. Yeah, and he wants re-election." Their words drifted down unnoticed, swallowed by louder voices rising from below. A small group of women stood together near the general store, their aprons dusted with flour from abandoned kitchen work. One held her child close, shielding him from the chanting crowd. "It ain't right." One whispered, "Girl looks barely 19. 19's old enough to lie," said another, though her tone carried doubt. "Old enough to be lied about, too." The women fell silent, glancing nervously toward the sheriff as he strutted near the tree like a rooster on a fence post, barking orders to keep the crowd moving, boiling, angry. Then the pastor arrived. His long black coat billowed behind him as he pushed his way through the men and women, Bible in hand. His face was stern, lined with both age and authority. "Sheriff," he called out loud enough to cut through the din. "This is a matter for the courts. Let her be taken inside. Let testimony be heard. She's guilty." The sheriff snapped, not even turning to look at him, and this town knows it. Voices cheered and jeered alike. The pastor held firm. "No evidence has been presented. No witness. No confession. She ran." The sheriff barked, "Only guilty people run." "She ran because you sent armed men after her." The pastor shot back. "Anyone would run." The crowd gasped. Someone shouted, "Pastor's right." Another yelled, "Sheriff's right." The uproar grew louder, hotter, heavier. The sheriff finally spun around to face him, his hand resting casually on his holster. Too casually. "You interfering in my work, Reverend." The pastor didn't back down. I'm interfering with injustice. A tense silence rippled outward. The woman at the tree watched, heart pounding, if the pastor pushed too hard. If the sheriff decided to make an example of him. But before she could worry further, a sudden distant noise cracked through the air, like the snap of leather, like a horse being urged too hard. Heads turned. Voices fell quiet. Dust rose on the horizon. A rider was approaching the town, fast, very fast, and the uproar simmered, shifting into something sharper, something laced with anticipation. Whatever happened next would not be calm. The rider approached like a mirage at first, nothing but a rising plume of dust in the distance, shimmering orange in the dying light. But as the dust cloud grew, the shape beneath it sharpened, a dark horse running hard, hooves pounding the cracked earth, its muscles flashing in the fire. Streaked sunset. The townsfolk turned as one, arguments forgotten. The sheriff squinted, shading his eyes with a hand. The deputy stepped closer to the tree as if preparing for trouble. Even the pastor fell silent. The only sound now was the rhythmic thundering of the incoming rider. The girl tied to the tree felt her breath hitch. Her heart began to race, not in fear, but in recognition. She knew that silhouette, not well, not personally, but she'd seen it once before. Far off in the canyons when no one else had. A lone rider standing between her and a bullet, a figure who disappeared before she even learned his name. Now he was riding straight into town. As the rider thundered closer, the wind lifted his long coat behind him like a dark wing. Dust spiraled off the horse's hooves, trailing him like wildfire smoke. His hat was pulled low, shadowing most of his face, but something about the way he sat in the saddle, straight, backed, calm even at full gallop, radiated a particular kind of danger. Controlled danger. The horse skidded to a stop at the edge of the crowd, dust exploding outward in a cloud that made several bystanders cough and stumble back. The man swung down smoothly, boots hitting the ground with a thud that felt heavier than it should. The sheriff stepped forward, hand resting again too confidently on the gun at his hip. We already had enough trouble today. He growled, "Don't need a drifter adding more." The stranger said nothing at first. He took a slow look around the gathering crowd, measuring, weighing, judging with eyes that were too sharp to miss anything. Then his gaze slid to the girl tied to the tree. His jaw tightened. "Untie her," he said quietly. The sheriff blinked, then he barked out a laugh loud enough to make a few horses rear back. "You given orders in my town, stranger?" The man didn't blink. "Untie her." Gasps rippled through the crowd like a sudden gust of wind. People shifted their feet, glanced at each other, unsure whether to laugh, intervene, or run for cover. The sheriff stepped closer, boots crunching in the dirt. "Who the hell do you think you are?" The stranger didn't answer immediately. He moved a step closer to the sheriff, the sunlight catching the metal buckle on his belt, the faint glint of a holstered revolver at his side. His presence alone pushed the sheriff back half a step, not visibly, not obviously, but perceptibly enough that the deputy noticed. The stranger finally spoke. "The man you're hunting," he said, voice steady, "ain't her, and the ones you should be hunting are 30 miles east of here, camped in Devil's Basin, fixing to cross the border by morning." A murmur swept through the crowd. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "You got proof. I saw them." He paused, "and I tracked them." "Tracked?" The sheriff spat into the dirt. "You expect us to believe you're some kind of bounty hunter?" "I don't care what you believe," the man replied. He turned his head slightly toward the girl. "But I know she's not who you think she is." The girl swallowed hard. She didn't know how he knew. She didn't know how he'd found her, but the certainty in his voice hit her like a lifeline. The sheriff looked the stranger up and down, sneer growing deeper by the second. "Even if you're tellin' the truth," he said, That don't explain why you're sticking your nose where it don't belong. The stranger's gaze darkened. Because she saved my life. A ripple of surprise swept through the crowd. The sheriff opened his mouth, then closed it again, thrown off his rhythm. The stranger stepped closer to the girl now, boots slow, deliberate. His eyes softened just enough to show he meant what he'd said. It wasn't a romantic look. It wasn't sentimental. It was deeper, an unwavering acknowledgement that something had passed between them once, something wordless yet binding. "Sheriff," the deputy said quietly behind him, "maybe we ought to listen." "Shut up." The sheriff snapped without looking back. But this time the deputy didn't. He swallowed, then spoke louder. "No, sir, he's telling the truth." The crowd stiffened. The sheriff spun around. "You siding with him over me?" "I'm siding with justice," the deputy said, voice shaking only a little. The stranger stepped fully beside the girl now. He wasn't drawing his gun, but his hand hovered near it. The sheriff noticed. Everyone noticed. "This ends one of two ways." The stranger said calmly, "You untie her." "And if I don't?" the sheriff hissed. The stranger's eyes narrowed. "Then the sun will set with one less lawman in this town." The air froze. The crowd held its breath. The sheriff's hand twitched toward his gun, and the stranger's fingers moved just a fraction of an inch, but the draw hadn't begun yet. Not yet. Not until someone made the first mistake.